Hi, Chris.
Hello, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Um, just give a bit of an intro, and then sort of you could take over from there a bit. So since 2010, you've published a ton of papers. I've worked out that it's roughly sort of 7.5 papers a year. So it's kind of like a paper every 50 days, right? On physics, the free energy principle, biology, philosophy, cognition, maths, free will, autism. So it's if the word polymath is to be used anywhere, it's right here. You've also published with Levin, Friston, Hoffman, some of my previous guests. So be looking to get some views on some of those fields and some of their theories. I promised my viewership that I would finish your physics as information processing course online, which is fantastic, by the way. I didn't finish that. Apologies, but I do have some questions about that specifically as well. So yeah, fantastic. Also, I noticed that you do some art, and it might be interesting to understand. And I think some of that visual art is perhaps you're suggesting it captures some of the ideas we're working with more technically, and that's fascinating. So perhaps something about that as well. So, Chris, how did you get into this stuff? Tell a bit about your background. You got a PhD in philosophy of science. So, kind of, how did you get into it, and why philosophy of science?
I started out as an experimental physicist, as uh, certainly some philosophers of science do. And I moved from there to teaching logic in the philosophy department as a graduate student, and started working in philosophy of science because that was kind of a natural thing for me to do, given my background, and was simultaneously becoming interested in biology. So for a while, I was a student in both philosophy and biology. But after I got my degree, I ended up with a small AI company that fairly quickly went belly up, but then working in an AI lab in New Mexico. And from there, moved into the Human Genome Project um, because I'd been working in bioinformatics. And so my career was kind of an odd mix of academia and the not-for-profit sector and then the private sector. So um, I don't know, my background's kind of a random walk through academic disciplines.
So, do you think, in some sense, that diversity of kind of experience and thinking, I guess, is that what leads to your sort of quite holistic approach to science and so on?
Well, it must have something to do with it. I'm very broadly interested in things, and that led to a certain lack of focus, shall we say.
Yeah, I think I can relate to this, and there's something that you said on this area, this idea of the convergence of the disciplines, and I think, if I may, I think you're quoted as saying that in some sense there should be no distinction between sort of physics, philosophy, biology. Is that fair? Did you really say that?
Well, yeah, I think that is fair. A few hundred years ago, there wasn't.
Mm.
And then with the rise of the university as an institutionalized system, and its departure from being primarily a religious system, we got this diversification of disciplines, which were natural when they happened. But I think what we started to see in the 20th century, and certainly you're seeing now, is that um, this old idea of cutting nature at the joints really doesn't make so much sense anymore. And people talk about theories of everything. What they typically mean is some sort of reductionist physics. But an alternative is this idea that there may be scale-free descriptions, mathematical descriptions, such as, for instance, free energy principle, that apply at many scales and maybe apply at all scales. And if that turns out to be a productive way to think, then I think we will see a real convergence of people who started out working in different disciplines, but who end up working in much the same way on problems at different scales, with a lot of ability to exchange ideas and techniques and methodology, maybe not experimental methodology, but theoretical methodology between disciplines. So I do think that's happening now, and that we'll see more of it over the next decade or so.
Mm. So, could I just ask us? I mean, do you think philosophy belongs in science in terms of theory, practice, and so on?
Well, in a sense, I think science can't escape philosophy, and philosophy can't escape science. So, um, a good friend of mine is a philosopher named Eric Dietrich, currently at Binghamton. He's actually one of my oldest friends. And he wrote a paper years ago called There Is No Progress in Philosophy. And he started this paper out imagining that uh, Aristotle appeared in a modern university and wandered around to the physics department and the biology department and the geology department and so on, and sat in on lectures and was completely baffled
Mm,
and very embarrassed because it seemed
mm,
like, everything that he'd said was wrong. But then he wandered over to the philosophy department and found that he understood everything, and the questions being talked about were exactly the same as the
mm,
questions he'd written about, and that his ideas were completely current.
mm,
So I we do have this background, if you will, of kinds of concerns that haven't really changed in millennia.
mm. Yeah.
And um, science doesn't make those concerns go away.
Mm, right. Yeah. Can it though? Do you think is it possible to peel back some layers and say yes, we can claim some metaphysical knowledge? Is that possible?
Well, I think we get clearer the more science we do about what in fact we don't know or can't know. So if you look at things like Hoffman's interface theory of perception or the notion of a Markov blanket in statistical analysis, for example, that underlies the free energy principle. Uh, these are kind of formal ways of saying what Hume was saying very informally. So we develop these formalisms that make it very clear that certain kinds of knowledge, when you talk about knowledge in some strong sense, are unattainable. And the great prophet of all of this is Gödel. And I think we see echoes of Gödel's work now increasingly throughout the sciences, uh, certainly in physics, in areas like game theory, and in all areas of science where math is playing a major role.
That's interesting. So, do you think Gödel's theory potentially applicable to language as well? Is there a sense in which language can never fully describe itself and this kind of thing?
Um, yeah, well, I think in a sense that's what Gödel's theorem says, that languages can't completely describe themselves. And um, the 1950s cyberneticists figured out that individual systems can't completely describe themselves. So the idea of a self model for any system is necessarily very limited.
Mm,
And it's always a model constructed by part of the system of the rest of the system. And it can't fail to be heuristic.
Mm, mm,
There are not enough degrees of freedom for it not to be heuristic.
mm.
So, and that cybernetic tradition uh, builds directly on early computer science, which built directly on Gödel. So
Right.
there's
Yeah.
a real lineage of ideas there that
Mm.
um, are now pervading more and more of science.
Mm. Chris, just want to go back to that idea of convergence across disciplines, right? So that I think the narrative is that that seems to be where the fruit is born. You know, when we abandon those kind of old, sort of divisions, if you like. Now, is that because the models that we're putting forward that do um, transcend the disciplines, is that because they're closer to reality? Or yeah, are they more? Are we getting closer to a reliable description of fundamental reality? Is it, if I could put it that way?
The way, at least the way I see this transition toward more scale-free descriptions, and certainly the way I see, say, the free energy principle, is as an approach to doing science or thinking about science that takes the idea of observation seriously and that um, applies scientific thinking to the process of observation
Mm,
and hence to the notion of an observer. So as we start to model ourselves as observers in this abstract way, as systems that are interacting with some other system, some environment, and thus exchanging information with it,
mm,
uh, we suddenly gain a whole set of formal tools that we didn't have before,
mm,
or we had them, we just didn't think to apply them to the idea of what we were doing
mm,
to science itself. And so this starts to look like a Gödelian situation, right?
mm,
Uh, the science itself becoming, in a sense, self-referential.
mm,
And indeed, when we apply these tools of basically the physics of interaction or the cybernetics of information exchange or whatever to the activity of doing science, we start to call into question ideas like replicability. Uh, Things start to look observer relative and
mm,
so forth. So a whole raft of um, what used to be thought of as ontological questions get heavily reformulated,
mm,
if not abandoned altogether. So
mm,
notion of an observer independent ontology kind of turns into the notion of a, a pragmatic ontology that a bunch of observers agree about.
mm. Yeah. So, if I may, I just want to sort of take the path into the sort of physics as information processing here, because some of what you're saying reminds me of. I got up to sort of lecture 4, I think, and I had a quick look at the space time one. And it's so beautifully elegant because it does away with all of the presuppositions, doesn't it? In the kind of physicalist account, it does away with the assumption that there's any kind of distance between interacting, agents, and it says this is about communication, right? So could you talk a little bit about that, and why is that? Why is it useful to sort of redraft the free energy principle in that sort of physics context, and what can be done with it? It'd be great to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I would say that, um, in a sense, in thinking about the free energy principle through um, the lens of physics, I'm following, in a sense, in Carl Friston's footsteps, and that he started out doing that uh, long before I did, uh, reformulating what had originally been ideas about neuroscience in a much more general language. And he was using a classical statistical language. But many of the ideas carry over into quantum theory beautifully, and quantum theory really just removes another couple of assumptions. So I think the argument for thinking in quantum information terms is that it allows you to make as few assumptions as possible.
Mm,
And one of the assumptions that you don't have to make is the assumption of an embedding spacetime, a
mm,
spacetime background.
mm,
And it that forces you to think about what spacetime is for. What role is spacetime actually playing in this theory? And one of the roles that spacetime plays in the classical free energy principle,
mm,
or in classical thinking about communication, is a role of keeping the communicating partners distinct by keeping them in different places. And so by imposing this notion of spatial coordinates, embedding the interacting systems in some fixed coordinate system, uh, you can make the difference between their state spaces obvious by putting those state spaces in different geographic places.
mm. They're
So
distinct, but they're distinct because of their distinct
right,
locations. Yeah, yeah.
right. So one can then ask, okay, well, what does that have to do with the idea in the free energy principle that's really playing a key theoretical role, which is the idea of mutual conditional statistical independence? Well, in a sense, if they're in different places, then you get that for free.
Mm,
You get it from relativity.
mm,
You get it from this notion that communicating across some distance requires time. And so the interaction is forced to be causal in the relativistic sense of information traveling at a finite velocity. So you get this idea of independence from the idea of spatial separation. And actually, there's a quotation that I've used in papers from Einstein that I am not going to be able to remember correctly, but it it basically comes down to look, this is just what statistical independence means. They're separated in a way, or this is just what separation means, that they're
mm,
statistically independent. So let's remove that assumption, okay, of this embedding space-time, and think of these systems as just occupying um, parts of some big joint state space, and call that the state space of the universe or whatever. Assume that this state space is isolated. There's nothing outside of it. It includes everything that's of interest.
mm. Does
And
this, does this, oh, sorry, go on.
then we can think about cutting this state space with a boundary any place we want
Mm,
in any arbitrary way. And we can ask, suppose I slice the state space in this way, uh, do I get systems on the two sides of this boundary that are conditionally statistically independent?
mm,
And it turns out that whether I get independent systems depends on how I describe the state space in the first place.
right, right.
Uh, this was beautiful work by uh, Zanardi and other people in the early 2000s showing that um, whether a system is entangled in the quantum theoretic sense, whether it's separable, depends on how it's described. So this notion of separateness isn't ontological in some sense. It's
Mm.
description dependent.
And doesn't
Uh,
it, in some sense, come with the issue of sort of action at a distance, doesn't it? If you say that there is some spatial distance that needs to be traversed in order for objects to have an effect on each other, in some sense, that sounds crazier than there being sort of just instant connections between communicating agents or something. That it sort of actually sounds crazier when you look at it. But intuitively, we think in terms of a space-time realm, don't we? It looks like we live in one, and that's what 90% of the sort of lay public would say that they're inside the cosmos, right?
Right.
Would you fundamentally disagree with that then?
Well, it's what I think at least 90% of the scientific community would say
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
And if
yeah. True, and
this,
philosophical as well. You know,
right. I
they've
mean,
gone
this
all in.
idea
Yeah.
of emergent space-time is a fairly new idea that I think is really limited to people who work in quantum gravity.
Right.
And even they're advocates for the idea that space-time is fundamental. Uh, but I think there's a growing movement of theories in which space-time isn't fundamental, in which it's emergent from something or other.
Mm, mm,
And the most obvious something or other is information exchange of some kind.
right.
And this idea, historically goes back to John Archibald Wheeler and papers that he wrote in the 70s. So it's at this point a 50-year-old idea at any rate.
Mm. So, have you
So
heard of Nima Ahmed, the high energy physicist? I mean, he's talking about these amplitahedra, which are kind of a spatial or a spatiotemporal, and they're projecting into space time, and they do better maths with scattering amplitudes and things like that. So, have you come across that work? And is that
right.
in the
Yeah, yeah.
space is that in the space you're talking about?
Right. Yeah. And they're I mean his focus has been on scattering. Uh, I mean, most of the work on emergent space-time is just focused on making some set of assumptions from which one can replicate general relativity, get some space that satisfies Einstein's equations.
Mm, mm,
So that's, in a sense, the other um, big component of this kind of theoretical work.
mm,
So I think it's interesting when starting to think about this to keep asking this question, what's space-time for? And uh, to also think about in our own experience, where does space-time come from? And uh, that latter question is a question that I think we can answer from a developmental biology and developmental psychology point of view. Uh, Certainly, infant humans, you can watch kind of learning about space-time by doing motor babbling, lying on their backs and waving their arms around, waving their feet around. And um, what's going on is their brains are starting to encode a representation of the relationship between muscular effort and visual feedback and proprioceptive feedback. So they're constructing a representation of space
mm,
by using uh, a resource that they have, which is um, a set of muscles and the ability to detect effort.
mm,
So you don't, in a sense, have to be born with this idea of 3D space. You can build it
And things like
by,
object permanence as well. You know, these are things that are
right.
learned, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah. They develop very early and we clearly have some prenatal, pre-sensory predilection to build this notion of object permanence. But it is a computation. It is something that we have to learn to develop. And I mean, that brings up the whole question of what's identity through time? What's time? Uh, why do we make this assumption that there's a past that we have access to it through memory, et cetera? And these are all
Mm,
just experiences that are happening right now.
mm,
But we layer all of this meaning onto them, which is very useful.
mhm,
And so we see objects as existing independently of us, even though every time we open our eyes, we're expending massive cognitive effort to figure out what's right in front of our faces.
Mm.
And the free energy principle is basically a theory of how we do that.
Mm.
Right? Do we have to do it entirely bottom up, like a lot of old theories suggested, or do we do it in this Bayesian way where we have a model that we just test for violations of,
Mm.
which is in a sense very efficient?
Do you believe in free will, Chris? If I could just ask that direct, straight question, or is that a bad question?
No, I think it's a good question. And, I'll refer back here to the a theorem that was published a couple of decades ago by Conway and Kochen with the title The Free Will Theorem. And they later published a paper called The Strong Free Will Theorem. And the latter paper, I think, is in the Bulletin of the American Mathematical Society. I can't remember where the first paper came out. But Conway is Conway of Conway's Game of Life, and Kochen is Kochen of the Kochen-Spector theorem, which is one of the fundamental theorems in quantum theory. So what they showed was in the first theorem, they mainly used reasoning from uh, relativity theory to show that if you have a situation with an observer and some system that's being observed, then if the observer is regarded as having free will in a very specific sense, they define free will as uh, if you have free will, your behavior is not determined by the what went on in your past light cone. So your past light cone is what can causally affect you in relativity theory. So if your behavior is not determined by what can causally affect you, i.e., uh, you're not subject to local determinism, then uh, everything you're observing has the same property, that its behavior is not determined by its past light cone.
Mm.
So that first version was basically the
Mm.
claim that, or the demonstration that if there's something in the universe that is not subject to local determinism, then everything else in the universe isn't subject to it either.
Mm.
And the stronger version of the theorem took away some of this observer relativity, um, or it really abstracted it, and it uses more of quantum theory, and it basically says that under kind of any reasonable reading of what the notion of observation means, nothing observable is subject to local determinism.
Mm.
So this is again a very specific uh, meaning of free will, and it's in a sense just the opposite of what is sometimes meant by free will. Right? Sometimes when people think about free will, what they mean is that if I have free will, I can execute local determinism.
Mm. Yes.
Right? So
I
if
can
you've seen
determine this is, yeah, I can, yeah,
right,
this is, yeah.
right, if you've seen talks by John Searle, for example, he was fond of saying, I have free will. If I think I want my hand to go up, then my hand goes up. Right? And um, that actually is contradicted by the free will theorem. The free will theorem says, no, you're not subject to local determinism,
Mm.
but you can't execute local determinism either because nothing else is subject to local determinism. So, what I think the free will theorem does is, at a deep level, is point out the contradiction between the notion of local determinism and the notion of global determinism.
Mm.
So the old kind of Laplacian notion of global determinism which is also evident in, for example, the Schrodinger equation, um, or the notion of unitarity in quantum theory, is the notion that everything evolves together, right? That the universe is one big system and it's undergoing some sort of evolution. And
Foliation, kind of, yeah.
and what one part of it does affects what every other part of it does.
Mm.
And that's really kind of a misstatement because in a pure quantum state, there aren't any parts. So
Right. Okay.
there's just one state and it's
Mm.
rotating around in its Hilbert space, and that's that.
Is that the wave function? Is that just
Right, right,
one
right, right,
universal wave function? Right?
right. So if you think that way, that's a very globally determinist way to think,
Mm.
but it's completely inconsistent with local determinism. Right? Uh, so I think that's really what this notion of freedom that Conway and Koken are pointing to uh, is indicating. Now,
Mm.
there's another way to look at that, which is a very common way to think about it in physics, which is freedom means the freedom, if you're a system, to choose a set of basis vectors with which to describe your observations. So if I'm an observer and I have some apparatus, then, for example, I can choose whether to set the magnets on my apparatus to observe spins in the vertical direction or spins in the horizontal direction. So a clean example is if I have a polarizing filter, I can orient it this way, right, or that way. That's my choice. I can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you think about this idea of choice of basis, it really corresponds to choosing what I'm going to be able to do with my measurements.
Mm.
And if you then think in kind of Gregory Bateson's terms about differences that make a difference, uh, the idea that meaning has to do with what I can do with some information,
Mm.
that meaning has something to do with actionability, then essentially by choosing my measurement basis, I'm choosing what I can do with the information that I get.
Mm.
So effectively, what I'm choosing is my semantics, my
Right.
way of interpreting the world.
Mm.
So this way of thinking about freedom of choice is I, as an observer, or I, as a system, am free to choose the kind of computations I do with the information that I get. So I'm free to choose the meaning that I assign to some information that's flowing in from my environment.
Mm.
And I'm also free to choose the the measurement basis.
When you say
Uh,
you're free to choose, Chris, these things are still just happening automatically, right? You're not talking about conscious sort of choice, yeah, right? You're just talking about
um,
the emerging model, right? Maybe.
yeah, you've introduced the notion of consciousness, uh,
Mm.
which is itself a very problematic notion.
Mm. Yeah.
So uh, let's stick to the language of choice now, and maybe talk about consciousness later. But uh, in this sense of choice,
Mm.
I can choose how to interact with my environment. So I can choose my meaning of the information that I give my environment.
Yeah.
Now, my environment has exactly the same freedom of choice that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's the Conway-Koken theorem. Um, and it's to the extent that my environment is conditionally independent of me, to the extent that it's separable from me, not entangled with me, it has free choice of basis too.
Okay.
So my environment can pick whatever meaning it wants to give to my actions on it, which are just
Mm,
its perceptions.
mm. And that brings in the idea of the Markovan boundaries, doesn't it? And so
Right,
this,
right, right, right.
could you perhaps talk a little bit about that, and the idea of, more fundamentally, what is a thing? And it will be, because, I mean, one of the things that Carl said to me when I spoke to him recently, he said that, in some sense, the active inference and so on is more fundamental than any physics, because in order to describe a thing, you need to understand what a thing is, right? So if you're going on to do the dynamics of things, you need to, what do we mean by things? So is that true?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to put it. Uh, I'm not sure that I would say that active inference is more fundamental than physics. I think I would say that active inference, in a sense, is fundamental physics.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
uh, again, think of some giant state space, just some bunch of degrees of freedom
Mm,
that uh, is the state space of what we want to call our universe of interest.
mm-hmm,
Everything that's relevant, everything that is going on, and we slice that state space someplace,
mm,
and if we've sliced it in kind of an appropriate way, then uh, we're going to find that the systems on the two sides of the slices have internal states that are not really involved in the interaction. So if
mm,
the boundary's fairly small compared to the size of the systems, the interaction's fairly weak.
okay.
Uh, so in Carl's language, the two are sparsely coupled. Uh, and again, in his language, uh, flows of information that start on one side generally stay on that side, and only a little bit of information is passed back and forth across the boundary. But the amount of information passed back and forth isn't trivial. So,
Mm,
we don't think of 2 gazillion degrees of freedom systems that are interacting with a 1 bit wide channel. Right?
mm.
They can't learn much about each other that way.
Yeah.
But suppose they're interacting via a reasonable channel with, a few million bits or something like that. Then
Mm,
they can talk back and forth. They can really exchange some information.
mm,
Um, but they still have lots of degrees of freedom with which they can play. Right? Their behavior is not determined by the behavior on the boundary. That's what conditional independence means.
right. Yeah.
So so we haven't talked about things yet. Right? We've
Can I
talked
just,
about
before we get to things, Chris, could I just ask, is there some sort of convergence there with some of Donald Hoffman's thinking there, um, around what you were just saying?
well,
Um,
yes, there is.
mm,
Don's uh, notion of an interface in
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
interface theory of perception just is this notion of a boundary
yeah, yeah. And I think
that
what I
that
was trying to say there
encodes
was,
the information that can be passed between systems.
it just that, yeah, I've reminded myself now. So what it was is because he uses evolutionary game theory to demonstrate, or formally demonstrate, that agents don't receive full information about their environment. In fact, it would kill them if they did, right? So we only receive what's useful to our survival, and so on and so forth. And that just seemed to remind me of what you were saying about the exchange transfer across that boundary. It's a kind of, yeah. Is there a parallel there, or am I just imagining things?
Yeah, no, there is a parallel there, and uh, I actually have a slide
Oh,
in
fantastic! Really,
a talk that let me just see if I have this uh,
that, that'd be awesome, Chris.
handy enough to show it to you in a sensible way. Um, yeah, here we go.
Mm.
Um, let me just share this slide on the screen.
Awesome.
There, can you see that?
Mm.
Great. Do I need to blow it up to full screen or
Let's have a look. That looks that no, no, that's perfect. Absolutely
that's
perfect. Yes,
perfect.
thank you.
Okay.
Mm.
So so let's think about this idea of dividing a universe into two pieces with a boundary.
Hmm.
And this slide shows three ways of doing it. And the way on the left is this idea of two really big systems that are communicating via a tiny channel. So they can't learn very much about each other.
That could be me and you, right? Or you and
Well,
I.
we're communicating by a small channel, but we can still exchange language, for example, and video. So there are a few million bits being involved here.
Mm.
Um, the example I gave here was John Wheeler's notion of a black hole that has a huge volume but a very small horizon. He called it a
Mm.
bag of gold, and there's almost no information flowing in or out of this black hole. So another extreme possibility is that um, the boundary is very large.
Mm.
So, and this is on the far right, um, so that the system on the left side here, almost all of its degrees of freedom are very close to the boundary. And what that means is that it doesn't have very many internal states, right? And in the limit, it doesn't have any internal states. All of its states are so close to the boundary that its state is completely determined by what's going on in its boundary.
Mm.
And that just means that it's no longer a distinct system, right? It's no longer conditionally independent of its environment. It's being completely controlled by its environment.
What kind of example in the real world is it? Sort of like a grain of sand or something like that, or a
Well, the example I used here in this talk, which was a talk for physicists, was a Boltzmann brain, which is this idea of a statistical fluctuation somewhere in the universe that has exactly the sensations and memories of a human being. But it's just a statistical fluctuation that lasts for a nanosecond or something.
mm. Mm.
So uh, its state is completely determined by just this momentary encoding on an environment on a boundary, and then it goes away.
Mm.
It doesn't have any actual degrees of freedom that are its. So uh, somewhere in the middle are boundaries that are just right. They separate systems that are both big, and they give them enough of a communication channel that they can exchange a fair amount of information.
Mm.
So I'll throw in something here, uh, which is the holographic principle from physics. And what the holographic principle says is that the total observable classical entropy of a system is proportional to the size of its boundary. And uh, one can infer from that the strength of the interaction between the system and the environment is proportional to the size of its boundary. And the technical version is that the bits on the boundary, so the bits that encode the entropy, uh, there are exactly enough bits on the boundary to encode the largest eigenvalue of the Hamiltonian operator that describes the interaction.
And it's a
So,
finite. It's a finite kind of
right.
discrete. It's finite discrete, isn't it? The geometry or
Yes,
the yeah.
right.
That's
The,
interesting.
the, the fundamental idea of the holographic principle is that information exchange is always finite
Mm.
between finite systems. So if we now think of this picture in terms of interaction strength, over on the left where the communication channel is tiny, the interaction is extremely weak. And over on the right, where the communication channel is enormous, the interaction is very strong. And because the interaction is very strong, it directly affects all of the degrees of freedom of the smaller system. And that's actually a condition that we call death.
Yeah, I was going to say, it crushes it essentially, doesn't it? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Mm.
the environment literally invades your body and interacts with all parts of it simultaneously. And that's
Mm.
not good for you.
Oh,
Right.
can I a quick question on that, Chris? You mentioned bodies. I mean, do you regard that is our body part of the environment? You know, where is our boundary truly? Is it the limits of our nervous system? Is it our mind, or is it our, you know, because it feels like bits of our body are at least part of the environment, fingernails and so on. You know, the
Well,
blood.
this
Yeah.
this boundary is something that we have, as theorists, have stipulated, right?
Mm.
So if I think about me, what I call me, whatever that thing is, uh, I can actually, in theory, at least, draw the boundary any place I want to.
Mm.
And depending on where I draw the boundary, or where I draw a boundary, I'm going to get different interactions.
Mm.
So if I draw a boundary that's located 3 meters from the center of my head, then most of that boundary is a boundary between, some air molecules and some other air molecules, and there's not
Mm.
much going on there at all. So if I say that I am everything within that boundary, then my interaction with my environment's pretty minimal.
Mm.
I could also draw that boundary around, Descartes' favorite organ. I could draw it around my pineal gland,
Mm.
and my pineal gland is busy interacting with my brain for the most
Mm.
part, and it's exchanging molecules and electric fields and stuff like that with everything around it. So its interaction is pretty strong. It's not strong enough to destroy the pineal gland,
Mm.
thankfully.
Mm.
Um,
He
but
he regarded that as the interaction seat between mind and matter, didn't he? That was
right,
the locus of that intersection, if you like. Yeah.
right. Um, and or I could draw it roughly at my skin. It's the boundary is arbitrary in a sense.
Mm. Okay.
The question is, how useful is that boundary
Yeah.
for describing it? Since the boundary fixes an interaction, the question is, how useful is that boundary for fixing an interaction
Mm.
that's of interest for some purpose, for
Yeah.
some explanatory purpose? So
Mm.
if I'm doing cell biology, I draw boundaries around cells and I ask how each cell communicates with its environment.
Mm.
And if I'm interested in some functional network in my brain, then I draw a boundary around, the salient network or the default network or some other network. And I say, how does that network communicate with its environment?
Mm.
Or I can draw a boundary around my brain or my liver or whatever
Yeah.
and say,
Well,
what's that interaction?
yeah.
What's that interaction like?
Mm. Could you do it with say personality? Could you stick a boundary around your personality?
Um, maybe, if I think of it as um, some kind of interaction pattern, some sort of dynamical uh, pattern
Mm.
that's implemented over time by some collection of degrees of freedom in some abstract space, then yes, I can draw a
Mm.
boundary around that pattern in that abstract space and say, how does that pattern interact with the other degrees of freedom, whatever they are, in that abstract space?
Mm.
And in the case of personality, I'm not really sure what that relevant space is.
Mm.
Uh, you've talked with Mike Levins, so he's probably talked a lot about this notion of multiple spaces that one can
Yeah.
use to describe organisms.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, you know, transcriptome space or morphogenetic space
Mm.
or whatever. And those are all interesting constructs that we've come up with conceptually.
Mm.
And there are probably lots and lots of others. But uh, our ability to to probe these things and really understand what they're like is very limited.
Mm. Yeah, and that reminds me again of the scale independence thing that you were talking about, and also another question I had, which I sort of put to Carl, and I think in some sense he said that the art, is almost by definition. But I wanted to ask you about the applicability of some of the sort of physics as information processing and the testability of these models. And can we use this stuff to do predictive modeling of the world?
Yeah. Um, Carl has talked about the FEP as a mathematical principle.
Mm,
And I like to formulate the FEP as the claim that any system that persists through time will act in a way that enables it to persist through time.
yeah,
So
yeah.
so it's obviously a tautology
Mm, mm.
formulated it that way.
But it's undeniable, right?
Right.
you know.
So
Mm,
it's just a matter of what these words mean. Words like boundary and conditionally statistically independent and so forth.
mm,
Once you once you explore the meaning of those words, then the FEP is obviously a good thinking tool.
mm,
And I would say the same is true for the interface theory of perception, right? If you think about what does it mean to interact with an environment while remaining distinct from that environment,
mm.
then the interaction has to pass through some sort of boundary.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
uh, what the information that passes through that boundary is the information you get.
Mm,
And if there's information that is swirling around outside that boundary, you don't have access to it.
mm,
Well, that just is the interface theory of
mm.
perception.
I think that's what, Chris, if I may say, I think that's what I find so beautiful and elegant about this stuff is that it's like you're chiseling away all of the assumptions and getting down to the absolute nuts and bolts, and you presumably are saying something about the world with that.
Yeah, I think what one's saying about the world is this is the situation in which observers find themselves.
Mm,
And to go back to one of your very first questions, that really is a philosophical question.
mm,
What is the condition that we're in
mm,
as cognitive systems? And
mm,
I think that's the question that these kinds of formal tools uh, is answering,
mm.
are answering.
Yeah. Cool.
And
We sorry, do you have something else? I was going to
no,
ask,
go ahead, go ahead.
what do you think about consciousness? Just ask the straight question.
Hmm.
What have you got on that?
Uh, I suppose I would characterize myself as a fairly inveterate panpsychist.
Right. Okay.
And because when I think of a system, myself included, which is interacting with some other system and environment, uh, what's happening? It's acting on me. It's giving me information.
Mm,
It's writing some data on my Markov blanket that I assign some semantics to,
yeah.
and then I do some processing and I write some stuff on the Markov blanket myself, and that's the information that I'm sending to it,
Mm,
to my communication partner out there. That's the rest of the universe, and it does with that information whatever it wants. I don't control what it does with that information
mm,
in the same way that it doesn't control what I do with the information it gives me. And again,
mm,
that's just what conditional statistical independence means,
mm,
which is the assumption that we've made about this boundary being kind of a Goldilocks boundary that leaves us some internal degrees of freedom.
mm,
So, what's my relationship to the data that's written on my Markov blanket, which from a physics point of view is just a bunch of bits?
Mm.
What's my relationship to those bits? And I think the most natural word to use to describe that relationship is awareness. I'm aware of those bits, right? They're doing something to me.
Well, Mark Soames says you feel them, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I feel
Mm.
them.
Mm.
Uh, they're a difference that makes a difference to me.
Mm. Yeah.
And
That's it, isn't it? Yeah, that's beautiful, actually. A difference that makes a difference. I've just wrapped my head around that now. Yeah, that's really cool.
uh, and some of those are bits that I have to have. I can't live without.
Mm.
Right? Some of them are the actual thermodynamic energy that I use to operate my body, to run whatever cognitive processing I do.
Mm.
And I have to have that, right? Or I fall apart.
Mm. Yeah, even perceiving costs energy, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
Right,
Mm.
right, absolutely. So, and all of this action that I do on my environment, I mean, a lot of the action that I'm doing on my environment is just dissipating heat,
Mm. Mm.
right? That's action of me on my environment too. So, um, the way I would respond to your question about consciousness is at the most fundamental level, uh, it is just the feeling of receiving information from the environment
Mm.
and the complementary feeling of giving information to the environment. Right? We feel action.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
that leads me to this.
Is it action or information? Sorry, Chris.
Well, I would say those are almost the same idea, right? In
Mm.
physics, action is a defined term and it's the product of energy and time.
Mm.
So if I expend some energy over finite time, I've made an action.
Yeah.
And if I'm writing a bit on my boundary, think of picking up a pen and writing a bit on a piece of paper.
Mm.
You're expending some energy in finite time.
Mm.
And the fundamental limit of how much energy I'm expending to write a bit in a way that for me is irreversible
Mm.
is given by Landauer's principle. It's log 2 kT. Uh, and I have to spend some time to do that,
Mm.
right? It's a process that has a beginning and has an end.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's
Mm.
it's that requirement of writing on the environment that forces me to implement my own internal clock that
Mm.
forces me to have some experience of time.
Mm.
Where
That's
I'm using the
interesting.
word experience here fairly loosely, but it
Yeah.
forces me to uh, be able, in a sense, to record the passage of time in my own
Mm.
structure. That
So what would you say? So there's have you've come across the term specious present? So the kind of almost like a length of a moment for us, you know.
right.
I just wonder what are your thoughts on that? Is that something to do with is that a measure of the volume of information that we're receiving, or the density of information, or something like that?
Yeah, I would say at some fundamental scale, it's um, the length of the minimal time window in which we can act.
Right. Yeah. Because everything's an interaction, isn't it? Actually, again,
Right,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Information is interact. It points to what you were saying earlier about fundamentally, it's about communication
right. Yeah,
between agency, presumably. That reminds me of a question for you, actually, Chris, because I've seen quite a few of your talks online, and in one of them, I think somebody asked you, could you have a cosmos or a cosmos without agency? And you said yes, it's conceivable, but nothing would ever happen. Right?
right.
I love that, and in a way, I think in some sense that points towards perhaps sort of talks to the panpsychism, this idea that there has to be some kind of agency in order for anything to have happened at all, right?
Right.
Do you stand by that? I mean, have I understood it, first of all? And
Yeah,
would you,
I probably actually quoted the Talking Heads, right? In that
great band,
there's that
freaking great band.
wonderful song.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Love them.
so th- think about what it means for something to happen. If we think about an isolated system in quantum theory, and we
Mm,
view it as an isolated system, so we don't try to draw any boundaries in it or anything else,
mm,
then it just sits there and it has some state vector in its Hilbert space.
mm,
And the state vector just sort of roams around the Hilbert space, right? It rotates. The only thing that changes is its phase. Uh, and its phase isn't an observable. And since we're talking about an isolated system, there's no one around to observe it.
mm, mm,
So, so this is a situation where um, one can say nothing is happening. And it's certainly the case that nothing observable is happening. So now, suppose I now theoretically, right, I'm stipulating something here. We have this system that's isolated, and we think about slicing it with a boundary.
right.
Now we've created two sides that can interact.
Mm,
And if the boundary is such that the two sides are conditionally statistically independent, then this interaction can be characterized in terms of information exchange. Now something's happening,
mm,
right? Now we have two observers and they're
mm,
looking at each other.
mm,
So they see a lot of information flowing in and they say, wow, I'm getting information from someplace. Something must be sending me information.
mm.
So uh, this idea of conditional independence, the idea of a boundary or a Markov blanket or an interface or whatever you want to call it, and the idea of interaction as information exchange all go together. They're all essentially the same idea.
Mm,
And it's it's that idea that expresses something happening, something
yeah.
observable by
Mm.
something.
And that reminds me, actually, Chris, if I may, I saw a talk with you and Joshua Back and Mike Levin. I think it was a few days ago. So,
Right.
go and watch that. It's fantastic. But Joshua said, space time is when you squint at automata. I thought that was a really, that was a really, really cool sort of crystallization, I think, of his thinking. But could you maybe unpack that a little bit for us? And I think you bought that. I think you're on board with that. So could you talk a bit about why you're on board with that, what it actually really means, and yeah, just interested in your thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, let's go back. Half an hour ago, you asked something about objects, and we never actually got to answering that question.
What's a
You know,
thing? Yeah, yeah,
what's a thing?
yeah.
So suppose I'm an observer. I've got this boundary, and I have this environment, and the environment's constantly writing stuff on my boundary, and it's the stuff that it writes on my boundary that I can see. I can't see its internal states by definition.
Mm,
That's what it means for them to be internal,
yeah.
and I can't control them. But I do have this constant play of data on my interface. And so suppose that uh, that data is not just noise. Suppose that I have sufficient processing power to say, oh, the value of this bit's correlated with the value of that bit over there.
Mm,
And so if I can identify some islands of coordination
mm,
that are reasonably stable, and I have the processing capability to uh, lock in on that and give that island of stability a name,
mm,
basically, then I can keep track of the history of that island of stability. And I can try to build a theory about how maybe that island of stability interacts with some other island of stability. Are they correlated some of the time and anti-correlated some of the time? And does it look to me like changes in the thing I'll call A
Mm.
uh, have some effect later on the thing I'll call B and vice versa? So can I see them talking to each other, even though they're just bit patterns on my boundary?
Mm.
So if I
Yeah.
can do all of that, I can say, oh, those are two things in
Mm.
my environment.
Yeah.
And um, I can describe them by Markov chains, right? They're just bit patterns.
Yeah. So
Um,
these are matrices, sets of numbers, right?
right, right. So that's why I responded positively to that remark. That what my physics, my theory of the world ends up being about uh, is, well, let's go back to the FEP for a second. What's my job as an active inference agent? It's to predict what my environment's going to do to me next.
Mm.
And that just means to predict what I'm going to see next on my boundary. Um, so if I have a bunch of patterns that I call objects, then predicting what I see next on my boundary is predicting what those objects are going to do next.
Mm.
Well, that's what physics is for,
Mm.
right? So physics and science in general becomes an attempt to describe what I see happening on my boundary.
Mm.
And the objects that it describes are the patterns that have some stability
Yeah.
on my boundary. And some of those patterns are other people, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Uh, and some of those patterns are tables and chairs, what I call tables and chairs, et cetera, et cetera. So Don Hoffman makes this very provocative remark that neurons don't have any causal power
Mm.
because neurons are just, things encoded on my interface.
Mm.
And he's
Mm.
making this same kind of remark that, my job as an active inference agent uh, isn't to know what my environment's doing.
Yeah.
It's to know what my environment's doing to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I can't help but be reminded of this conscious agent theory that
Right,
seems similar to some of your position in that it presupposes no manifold in which the agents exist. It's just you could imagine it as kind of like a Twitterverse almost, sort of
right.
interconnecting agents that and yeah, yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
I mean, I think one of the
depending,
hardest things to wrap my head around there is the idea of a timeless realm. And obviously, Donald talks about these non-entropic dynamics. I can't wrap my head around that, to be honest, Chris. But and also, Carl suggested that I think you'd suggested that time is emergent as well. So there isn't even an underlying chronology underneath. So space and time are emergent phenomena. Is that fair?
yeah, I think that's fair. The notion of emergence, however, is different in the two cases,
Okay.
or shall we say the formal mechanism of emergence is different in the two cases. So we talked a moment ago about action and about writing bits on the boundary and about the fact that doing that or having any memory of doing that, being able to write on my environment, write on my boundary,
Mm,
and and go back to that place and have some reasonable uh, assurance that what I wrote is still going to be there. Right? It's like writing in my lab notebook. I expect that what I write there is going to be there tomorrow,
mm.
and that the world hasn't come and changed it while I wasn't looking. Right? We all make that assumption.
Mm,
Uh, if I'm able to do that, then I have to implement this clock. and the writing process gives me the ticks of the clock, right? Every
Mm,
time I write a bit, there's a clock tick.
yeah.
Say, I did that. Now I did that. Now I did that. So
Mm,
I, as an agent acting on the environment, have to implement a clock. I have to be a clock
mm,
in part. And the clock that I am defines a time arrow for me. And my time arrow points through my boundary, right? Because I'm
yeah.
acting on it.
Mm,
So there's this directionality. And we can view time as running in either direction. We can review view time as moving from me into my environment, or I can think of time as moving from my environment into me because it's riding on my boundary also, and I see those
mm,
bits as perception. So that's kind of arbitrary. Which way is future and which way is past doesn't matter. But once we fix a direction, then um, the the past is the previous ticks, and they're recorded by writing on my environment in a way that I can read. And the future is where information is coming from.
So you're saying that we're not really in a temporal sort of domain. It is just almost as Immanuel Kant suggested, like a kind of mode of human perception, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's more general than human perception. I think
Mm,
that
yeah,
every piece of the universe implements a clock,
yeah.
its own clock that's relative to it. It defines its own time arrow.
So what would you say, just more generally then, what is a mind, Chris?
Oh, oh, I think
In some sense,
I'll be maybe
you've already kind of implicitly answered it in some ways, haven't you? But I just wondered if
right.
to sort of state your
Right.
clearer.
Yeah, I'll be a bit provocative here. I think a mind is a story that we tell ourselves.
Mm,
My mind is a representation that I construct of an identity and a set of processing capabilities and a set of past experiences and all of that.
mm, yeah.
And I construct all of that when I need to,
Mm,
not necessarily all the time. Uh, I'm very interested in these flow states and meditative states and other states
mm,
which are not self-conscious, where
mm,
this story about personal identity is not being told. So in a sense, this notion of a mind is not being constructed.
mm,
But if you stop and think about uh, me as an agent and having done this and having to ask these questions and investigate these things, etc., then one is telling the story of a mind,
mm, yeah.
and that's what I think a mind is, a story.
That's really interesting because that reminds me of something Mike Levin said about this as well. I kind of asked the question slightly differently. I said, what is a human identity? And I can't remember the name of the thinker, but he quoted some guy who said that thoughts are thinkers, right? And so
William
there's
James, yes.
that's it. Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, the guy who offered up a kind of definition of intelligence as well, which sort of Mike seems to subscribe to. But um, but actually that got kind of creepy for me in a way. I thought that so people that have perhaps unwanted thoughts and sort of certain mental health conditions and so on and so forth, there's a sense in which those are competing agents actually within this, within our minds, if you can put it that way. Um, and I said, so what's the identity? And he said, well, or the homunculus. I said, well, that's just another one of these stories that kind of anchors all of the other stories together somehow. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think you're both capturing his thinking correctly and making sense.
Wow. That doesn't happen very often. Thanks, Chris. But yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? You know, because that's obviously got massive implications for an understanding of human personal identity. You know, big area in philosophy.
Right, right. Um, well, I basically think Mike's right about that. That um, we can have, and there are people who have a very detailed notion of who they are and what they are and what their past is and all of that.
Mm,
And uh, people who don't have a very detailed notion of it, and people who perhaps have multiple notions of it.
mm,
I have a colleague who says that she lives kind of multiple timelines simultaneously. And I can't really make sense of that, but
wow.
you know, that's her report of her experience. Um,
So there's some dissociation within her own mind, if you like. They're different identities, essentially.
yeah, probably. She seems perfectly happy with that way of being.
Mm.
Uh, I think there's a vast range of possible experiences here, and some of them are deeply disturbing to some people,
Mm,
and this is a real question that I have: is what's the what's the range of what we could call neurodiversity or cognitive diversity, and how do these various conditions relate to function,
mm,
and how do they relate to the emotional experience of people who are having them?
mm,
And I suspect that um, there are experiences that make some people extremely uncomfortable, and that other people view as an achievement.
mm. Yeah, depending on your point of view. Could I ask a sort of just popped into my head actually? What are hallucinations? And you know, given what we're saying about our sort of apprehension of the external world, we're saying that it's a kind of like a negotiated impression, right? Essentially on our sort of screen of perception, should we say?
Mhm.
Um, so a hallucination, in some sense, is still just that, right? And so, you know, if we're going to, if we, you know, so basically, if I see a leprechaun, in some sense, that's still real, isn't it? You
Well,
know,
it's yeah. If I have let's
yeah. Break that
right,
down. That's yeah.
yeah, reformulate this in maybe less or in more neutral language. Um, Suppose I'm kind of rolling along and I suddenly have an experience that's completely unlike the experiences I've had for the last few minutes.
Mm,
And then my next experiences are rather like the experiences that I had
mm,
in the last few minutes, except for this one. Then I'm going to say, well, that was odd.
mm,
This is a massive spike in my variational free energy. Um, what's going on? And so I can look around the world, and there may be some reason that I had that odd experience. But maybe I can't find one.
mm,
So it's just an unexplained odd experience. So I tell myself some story about it. You know, uh, the environment did this to me for some reason, or something along those lines. Uh, you know, I dropped a bit somewhere in some computation. Things went haywire for a couple
mm,
of minutes. But uh, the bottom line is, I don't know what happened.
mm,
Right, there was some big violation of my predictive model, and then it stopped. Touch wood, and I don't know why.
mm.
So I
So I'm
suspect
thinking,
that
in some sense, I'm sorry, Anil Seth, the sort of British neuroscientist, he says that everything's a hallucination. And he says that what we're just the whole thing is hallucination. What do you think of that?
Um, well, it may be that the mechanism of hallucination and the mechanism of perception are the same.
Mm,
I think what causes us to say, "Oh, that was a hallucination," is that it's not expected, and once it's happened, it isn't explainable, or the details weren't explainable.
mm,
So, we go to sleep at night, we have some dreams, and we sort of expect to have dreams when we go to sleep. We sort of expect them to be weird. Um, and it may be that we have a certain amount of difficulty sometimes saying, did this happen or did I dream it? Um, but
mm,
we're not all that shocked by this fairly regular nighttime experience of having dreams.
right.
But if if stuff like that happens while I'm, you know, driving home sometime,
Mm,
then that's kind of disturbing. And I say, oh, what was that?
mm,
And it's then that we use words like hallucination.
mm,
And I think we use them to indicate our surprise and our inability to come up with an explanation.
right. Cool. Um, could I ask what you think about it? Mark Soames told me a little story the other day. He said that Thomas Nagel declared that Mark Soames' theory of consciousness was probably on the right track, or at least one of the best attempts at it so far. And I just wonder, what do you think about the Mark Soames theory of the reticular activating system being the seat of consciousness? I mean, what are your thoughts on that, if I may?
Well, I certainly find his data about lesions in that area inducing
Mm,
irreparable coma, and his experiences with what would it be, acorticate infants, very
mm,
compelling.
yeah.
I saw one of his talks about a year ago and
That's where you can
discussed with him.
interact with them, but they've got no cortex. Is that
Right,
right?
right.
Yeah,
They basically have a brainstem
yeah.
and a little bit of midbrain, I think, enough to have an amygdala and that sort of thing, so they can
Mm.
experience emotions.
Effective.
Um,
It's effective, isn't it? So there's no higher cognition,
right,
but they feel.
mhm,
You know.
right, and
Mm,
that's I find all of that very interesting. I mean,
mm,
it seems completely clear to me that in those individuals something's going on.
mm,
Like there's some awareness, something is being felt,
yeah.
uh, even though there's there's none of what we would call cognition going on, let
Mm,
alone what we would call metacognition. So there's not a mind, right?
mm,
There's not this constant story about them. They're not telling a constant story about themselves, right? They don't have um, memories,
mm. They can't. They by definition
right? I
they can.
mean
Yeah.
that equipment is missing.
Mm. So there's no directing sort of, we might say homunculus perhaps, but and of course I think Mark Soames likes that model in a sense. He says that because perception itself isn't aware, is it? Right? That they are kind of they're information systems, right? It's
Mhm.
the thing that looks at the screen of perception that is that and so that's kind of his answer for the homunculus problem, isn't it? So, well, the homunculus is this affective state that's brought about by the reticular activating system. I mean, that's phenomenal in a way, isn't it? Do you feel like he's sort of gone some way to solving the hard problem there? And then he surprised me actually by saying that he was very sympathetic to some of the idealist thinking. He was actually quite sympathetic to the likes of Kastrup and Hoffman as well. Because I thought, well, hang on, if he's located a seat of consciousness, doesn't that make him a physicalist? But of course not. He says he's a dual aspect monist. So I'm bloody confused, Chris, I think. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, That's a very complicated, multidimensional question.
So, you've
I
got
mean,
10 minutes.
right. I mean, I think Mark has very carefully localized a region of the nervous system that is essential for what we call awareness at the or what we call human awareness, right?
Mm,
Uh, there's some system in, say, those even in a coma patient that we could draw a boundary around and say that system is quite aware of the heart rhythm, and it's actually monitoring the heart rhythm and responding to changes in the heart rhythm. But that's not human awareness. That's not what we regard as our awareness. It's the
mm,
awareness of some, you know, ganglion in the brainstem. So
mm,
Mark has very carefully circumscribed a part of the nervous system that's a necessary condition for what we regard as human awareness. And the word consciousness is very often employed to indicate much more than that basic state of uh, emotional arousal. You know, it's often used to indicate uh, narrative metacognition, for example.
mm. Yeah.
So the the field of consciousness studies is full of uh, ambiguity and um, conversations going on at cross purposes because the basic words mean different things
Mm,
to different users. So setting that kind of linguistic confusion aside, if we ask about the hard problem in the formulation of, is this system aware of anything at all? Is there anything going on experientially? Then I
mm,
think we have to say that Mark's acorticate patients are aware of something or other.
mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even if they have none of what we would call intentions.
Mm. Yeah, he said you could tickle them and they'll respond, you know. There's
Yeah.
an effective
So,
bit, yeah.
right. There's an effective response.
Yeah.
And we can certainly do that sort of experiment with many, many organisms
Mm,
and get some kind of response. And that's why I'm very sympathetic to this New York Declaration about Consciousness, for example, that if we think in these very stark, is there any experience at all
mm,
terms, then I think we have to go very deep.
mm,
And once we go very deep in that way, which is kind of a uh, an empathetic or kind of compassionate way, then the theory that we use to describe these systems tends to force us to go even deeper.
mm.
And you know, uh, people like Galen Strawson followed that path, I think, very eloquently 20 years ago. So I don't think any of what I've said about radical panpsychism is at all new. Whether that has anything at all to do with the sort of materialist idealist debate isn't clear to me. I
Mm,
mean, it seems to me that when one thinks in terms of things like objects are emergent, space-time is emergent, uh, semantics and all of this stuff is observer relative,
Mm,
then the materialist idealist debate is sort of dissolved anyway.
mm. And I suppose in
It's
some
not clear
sense,
how that debate gets any traction with
mm.
that observer relative kind of view of things.
And even without a sort of substance claim about the nature of reality, you can crack on and do the science and you know free energy principle anyway, can't you? It's almost to some degree perhaps doesn't matter. Um,
Yeah.
maybe. Um,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. I had another question. I'm not sure how we're doing for time. A few minutes. Are you good for a few more minutes or?
Sure, sure, sure.
Okay, I was going to just sort of perhaps go even more sort of abstract and fundamental and say, what do you think mathematics are? And why do we have this thing that gives us this means of identifying regularities in the world?
Mm.
And the Mike Levin example of the normal distribution that emerges from dropping the balls, and where is that stuff? Why do we get it as a free gift?
That's a very good question. And yeah, that is a question that I wonder about. Oh, I'm 30 years ago, maybe. Uh, Lakoff and Nunez published a wonderful book called Where Does Mathematics Come From? And in it, they outlined um, a theory of mathematics that was uh, very much based on metaphors of motion. And if you think about uh, abstract mathematics, things like category theory or even abstract algebra, you express many of these relationships by diagrams that with circles and arrows, and
Notation. Yeah. Mm,
you prove theorems by taking your finger and moving along the diagram and seeing if everything works. So uh, you're kind of enacting this kind of metaphor of motion as mathematical relationships as metaphors of motion.
mm,
So I found this very compelling, this idea. And if one looks at what's lit up in an fMRI scanner when people are doing mathematics, you see a lot of activity in the motor system and the motor planning system.
okay,
So
that's
there
interesting.
seems to
Mm,
be some sense to the notion that when we're doing mathematics,
mm,
we're actually doing it as a metaphor for motion or a
mm.
metaphor for manipulation. Uh,
So we're
when you're
moving through space. We're moving through space in some mad sense while we're
right,
doing it.
and
Yeah.
we're moving objects from one place to another.
Mm,
We're saying, what's the relationship of this set to that set? Well, there's some arrows, and I can think about, moving this little ball over here and moving
mm,
this over here and putting it next to that one. And, it all seems very performative,
mm,
very kind of motion oriented. And so when you ask what is mathematics, it seems to me like it could really be an abstract encoding of our notions of space and objecthood and identity and all of that
mm,
stuff. And at the same time, it looks like it's this gift we get for free.
mm. But
Well,
in some sense, you're saying it's about walking and running and jumping.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
that's that's fast. That's fascinating. Yeah.
I think that's certainly what Lakoff and Nunez would
Yeah,
say.
because the human body has to do a shed load of mathematics to be able to propel a ball, through a
Right.
stadium sort of thing. So, is it a glimpse into that in some sense?
I at least I don't find that what's the right word? I don't find that implausible.
Mm,
I think it could very well be that we get this for free because we are, embodied agents and we do have this kind of inactive form of cognition.
mm,
I mean, this whole story about objects being uh, patterns of correlation that we see on our interfaces is not a million miles from things that Maturana and Varela were saying in the 70s or 80s. So
mm,
um, there are a lot of threads leading into this way of thinking from various historical antecedents.
mm. And as you said earlier, some of these problems go back as far as ancient Greece.
Right,
So
right, right.
and
Yeah,
was it who was the guy that said that everything we're doing now is just footnotes to Plato? Was that Whitehead, wasn't it? It was Whitehead.
yeah, could be.
But Chris, I mean, I appreciate we're the end of the 90 minutes there. So do you want to keep to time? Should we stop it there?
Yeah, that's probably a good place to stop, actually.
I mean, I've
This was
got
a lot of fun. Thank you very
this
much.
was I really enjoyed this, Chris, and yeah, I got tons more questions for you. So maybe you could come back one day in the future. And thank you so much for spending the time with us.
Okay, well, thank you.
Cheers, Chris. Take care.
Yes, cheers.
Bye bye.
Ciao.